Good morning to you all. Just before we start with the sermon today, I wanted to make a brief comment about me, and to thank you all, or those of you who have been praying for me. You may not all realise that for the last couple of years I've been fighting a bit of a health problem, and there's been 4 lots of surgery. And last month went to the specialist for the most recent checkup, and before I got there I got the usual message, don't eat anything for several hours and then don't drink anything for several hours, and I was expecting surgery number 5. It was to do with a problem with my vocal cord, which really has prevented me from speaking very much, and so I haven't. I've been declining opportunities to preach and to do other presentations over the last couple of years. And the specialist, I was only there for a few minutes. She put the camera, through my nose, a bit like, with a COVID, and he had a camera on it, and he goes right down and had a look at the vocal cords, and she couldn't find anything wrong. It seemed to be all fixed. The fasting that morning was unnecessary, and she said, come back in July, we'll have another look then. So I'd just like to thank those of you who have been praying for me, and I know some of you have, and it's a good thing that we do some praying, isn't it? All right, today's message, the 5th Gospel. And I think this has had a little bit of intrigue, people wondering, what's this 5th Gospel all about? So let's get into it and find out. It was, of course, written long before any of the Gospels in the New Testament. This document that I'm calling the 5th Gospel, it's not its real or official name, but it's commonly called the 5th Gospel. It's quoted by all of the other Gospels, and in fact it's quoted by just about every writer in the New Testament. Not all of them, but almost any. And you can see there, I've gone through and done a count. I found that it's quoted 66 times. That's interesting in the New Testament. Interesting number, isn't it? 28 by Paul, and he uses it 19 times, or quotes from this document 19 times in his letter to the Romans. It's also... let's see, did I turn that off? No? Looks like our pictures are not moving on. Here we are, we've got it. All right, there was a discovery made back in about 1948 near Jerusalem, a place called Qumran. This was the Dead Sea Scrolls. And among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a copy of this particular document that I'm talking about. And the interesting thing about that is it's 400 years older than the most recent copies we have of the New Testament. So the copies that we use to translate our Bibles, particularly the King James Version, the Old Testament of that was about 1,900 AD is the oldest manuscripts of that, the Codex Sinaiticus, until we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls took us back to a time about 100, 150, even 200 years before the time of Jesus. And this particular document was among them. And guess what it's called? It's called the Isaiah document. Now, I don't know if that was a surprise to any of you. A number of people said to me, well, what's this 5th Gospel about? And there were a number of guesses. It is, in fact, the Gospel of the book of Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, but it's called the 5th Gospel. And why? It's because the Gospels in the New Testament lean more heavily on the contents of the book of Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, than of any other of the prophets. There's only one other book that refers to Isaiah more often, there's only one other book that's referred to in the Gospels more often than Isaiah, Do you know what it is? An Old Testament book? No, it's Psalms. There are more quotes from the Psalms where Jesus refers to various parts of the Psalms and sees them as the fulfillment, as being fulfilled in his life. But the second most often, and certainly the most prevalent in the prophets, is the book of Isaiah. And of course, the picture there we have is from the Sistine Chapel in Rome, Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel, his depiction of Isaiah. So our topic today is Isaiah, the fifth gospel. The sections that we're going to, or the segments of my presentation today will be on the prophet. He is the prophet of peace. He predicted peace. We're going to have a look at Isaiah the man, get to know him a bit better, Isaiah the book, and those remarkable passages known as the suffering servant. Now, many of you will be familiar with what we're talking about today because, of course, we've been studying the book of Isaiah in Sabbath school. At least some of you have. Others of you have been doing other things. But the book of Isaiah, certainly the research that we have on the book of Isaiah in our current lessons is excellent. They were written by a person called Roy Gain. I remember his father. His father was one of my teachers when I was at college, Erwin Gain. This is the younger guy, his son, who's now one of the professors at Andrews University and a specialist in Old Testament. But first of all, Isaiah is the prophet of peace. And he's very well known as the prophet of peace. Here's a statue. Do you know where that statue is? Anyone recognise it? It was done by a Russian sculptor. It's located in the grounds of the United Nations in New York. And it's based on a text in Isaiah. He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for the peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But after World War II, people were looking for peace. We didn't quite get it, did we? If we look back on the history between World War II and now, it didn't quite happen. But anyhow, the United Nations was set up with this great idea of perhaps fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy. And inside the building, we have really the Isaiah wall, it's called, and it quotes that same text, Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4. So the prophet Isaiah has certainly been very influential in many, many ways. Let's find out a little bit about Isaiah himself, Isaiah the man. Well, let's begin, I think, with a little bit of understanding of the historical situation, when he lived. And on this timeline that I've put together, we have an approximation of the date the time, about 1250 BC, when the Israelites who had taken out of Egypt during the Exodus and were led by Moses and then by Joshua, settled in the land. Now that date is not hard and fast, and some people suggest a date in the 1400s BC. I've taken one of the more recent dates for that. Then, several hundred years later, we can't be exact because of the inexactness of the dating, the kingdom was divided between Judah and Israel. So once they settled in their promised land, several centuries later, there was a split, you might say, a civil war. And the nation was split into two nations. One was called Israel, and the other was called Judah. Isaiah was called to the ministry or to be a prophet in 742 BC, and we can be more precise about that date because he tells us in chapter 6 of Isaiah that he was called in the year, his call happened in the year that King Uzziah died. And we know when that was, 742 BC. And he came on the scene, as we'll discuss a little later, when there was a whole lot of political turmoil going on. mainly because Assyria was on the ascendancy, and it became a threat to both Israel and Judah. And in fact, in 701, just 40-odd years after the call of Isaiah, what Isaiah had prophesied happened, and Israel fell to Assyria. So from 701, there was no more Israel, only Judah. And then Isaiah died, and again we don't know exactly his death date, but estimated here at 698 BC. You'll notice we're counting down. We're counting how many years before the time of Christ. So the closer you get to the time of Christ, the lower the number. It's the opposite when we're going the other way of after the time of Christ. All right, the word in Isaiah means God is salvation. And his father was called Amos, not Amos, but Amos. And he was the brother of King Amaziah. So Isaiah was, you might say, related to royalty. He was the son of the king's brother. And he was called to prophecy, as we mentioned, in 742 BC. And this coincided with the expansion of Assyria, and it was a big threat. And Isaiah proclaimed this to be a warning from God. If you people don't do the right thing, something bad is going to happen in the form of being conquered by Assyria. He was married to the prophetess. Now we don't know her name, that's not given in the book. And whether being called the prophetess is because she was a prophet too, or simply because she was married to the prophet, again, there's no clear answer to that. They had 2 children, 2 sons. The oldest was, how do we say this? Tchg, perhaps. And his name had a meaning. It meant a remnant shall return. You see, Dad, Isaiah, had been predicting captivity, and he gives his oldest son the name, a remnant shall return. And his second son, he got a longer name and perhaps a more gloomy one. It's Hashbez, meaning spoil quickly, plunder speedily. So there we are. The boys got saddled with Dad's mission in a way, in their names. It's clear that the whole family was united in this commitment. Now, we've been talking about the geographic situation. You have right at the top there the Assyrian Empire. You've got this kingdom of Israel, which disappeared in 701. And then we have the kingdom of Judah, which survived for a time. And back over here to the left, or the west, just off the map, you would have, and west and south is Egypt. And of course, over to the east, you have Babylon. All right, so what happened? Shalmaneser, he was an Assyrian king, Shalmaneser V, and he destroyed Samaria in 755. Here we have Samaria. And he attacked it and destroyed it in 722 BC. But as long as Ahaz reigned, Judah was okay. Now, we remember Ahaz as being a pretty bad sort of a character, and he was. But what he did to survive was he paid a big heap of taxes to Shalmaneser. And so long as Judah kept on paying these exorbitant taxes to the Assyrians, they were left alone. Ahaz, the bad king, was followed by, do you know his name? The good king. Hezekiah, yes, Hezekiah. Now, when he got to the throne, he said, no more of this. We're not going to pay those Assyrians anymore. And he did something which was perhaps a little foolish. He went into an alliance with Egypt. He says, okay, we're paying tribute to Assyria. We'll do a deal with Egypt instead and tell Shalmaneser to go get lost. Well, what happened? Another king came along, another Assyrian king. He followed Shalmaneser, and his name is Sennacherib. Nice name that, isn't it? I don't think so. Sennacherib. Not a very nice history, and they were very cool people. He led a powerful army into Judah in 701 BC. And Isaiah encouraged Hezekiah to resist those Assyrians. Don't give in to them. Now, I'm just going to go back a couple of, this slide. You'll notice where Jerusalem is and this other city called Lachish. He actually conquered Lachish, destroyed it, and now he was threatening Jerusalem. And then he sent a very threatening letter to Hezekiah. We read about that in chapter 37 of Isaiah. And Hezekiah spread this letter out before the Lord and prayed over it. What shall we do? And here we have a dramatic answer to prayer. What happened? Well, Hezekiah listened to what Isaiah had to say. And here's quoting now from Isaiah chapter 37, verses 33 to 36. He, that's referring to Sennacherib, he will not enter the city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter the city, declares the Lord. I will defend the city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. So here was a very bold prophecy in the face of this apparently all-conquering, cruel Sennacherib. What happened? Just a few verses on, verse 36 of the same chapter. Then the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian army, or an Assyrian camp. And when the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. And history records that's what he did. He stayed there. It was his last campaign. So this man who had been feared so much throughout the Near East really got his hair clipped. 185,000 of his troops were put to death. And this was done without the people of Judah doing anything to defend themselves other than praying. Prayer's a mighty weapon, isn't it? You might have heard of this old poem. Some of you might have learned it at school, or maybe if you're older than me, there won't many of you left if you are. But this is one I remember from years ago. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold. These cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. Powerful poem, recording a powerful, dramatic event, which is another one of those myths of the Old Testament. Or is it? Did it really happen? Well, the archaeologists did a bit of digging, and I'm very happy to confirm it really did happen, and we got proof of it. Back in Nineveh, in fact in 1830. This hexagonal prism was found, And it records the events. It says, and this is Sennacherib, as for Hezekiah, the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, I shut him up in his royal cage, or royal city, like a bird in a cage. So although he didn't actually defeat Jerusalem, he's boasting that he had him trapped in there, shut him up like a bird in a cage. Now there are carved reliefs in his palace depict the Assyrian attack against the city of Lachish. Remember we mentioned Lachish before, and Lachish was defeated. Its defeat and the procession of prisoners before the king seated on his throne. So there's a carved relief showing that. But Jerusalem was spared. And this, of course, is a powerful and a vivid testimony to the accuracy of what we've been reading in the book of Isaiah. Sometime later, in fact, in the year 2009, some explorations or excavations in Jerusalem uncovered a seal impression containing the name Isaiah, the prophet. So here we have something that's dug up from Jerusalem from ancient times, going back to the time of Sennacherib, and it's mentioning Isaiah. And it was found less than 10 feet away from the seal impression of Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. So these events that we've been talking about in the Bible are now being confirmed and have been confirmed over a century or more to have really happened. At Lachish, in 2014, students from the Southern Adventist University uncovered 2 seal impressions of Eliakim. And this was found at the city of Lachish. And according to Isaiah chapter 37, verses 1 and 2, all 3 individuals, you've got Hezekiah, Eliakim and Isaiah, were present in Jerusalem during the invasion of Sennacherib. Now I find that great to be able to refer to things of history and archaeology and see how they confirm the writings of this probably greatest prophetic book of the whole Bible, the book of Isaiah. Another one of Isaiah's prophecies was about things that would happen 150 years after his death. And this had to do with the release from captivity. He had prophesied that the people would go into captivity in Babylon, but he also prophesied they'd been let out several years later. And the Cyrus cylinder, this was discovered also a long time ago in modern Iraq back in 1879 during a British museum dig. Now we know that Isaiah's ministry lasted from about 742 to 685, and Isaiah accurately predicted Cyrus by name and described his activities. And Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC. Now that's well after Isaiah's death, isn't it? Well after. And the Cyrus cylinder confirms the policy that Cyrus had of returning the captives back to their native lands, not just the Jewish people, but other people as well, and of restoring their sanctuaries. So here again, we have confirmation, quite independently of the Bible, of what it says in Isaiah. Well, Isaiah, of course, as we mentioned, died long before these events. How did he die? Well, how did he die? Do you know? Nobody knows how Isaiah died? What did you say? Cut in half, thank you. Yeah. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us that. Well, it almost tells us that. But there was a Targum. You possibly, who knows what a Targum is? That's a tough question. It is a document, thank you, usually written on clay. The Jewish Targums were translations from the Hebrew Bible, or Hebrew, we call it the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, into the Aramaic language. And they call that a Targum. And in the period after the exile, that is after the people were allowed to come back out of Babylon, and Cyrus had allowed that to happen, the Aramaic language became more common than Hebrew. And in that, what we call the post-exilic period or post-exile period, Aramaic was the language on the ascendancy, and many Jewish people didn't understand Hebrew. And the Targums were a translation from Hebrew, not only of the Bible, of course, but, well, yes, probably, I'm not certain, but probably, yes, of the Bible into their Aramaic language. And one of these Targums told the story of his martyrdom, and apparently, according to this, he had fled from King Manasseh. Now, Manasseh came on after Hezekiah, you might remember, and Manasseh was a pretty bad sort of a guy. And Isaiah was fleeing from Manasseh, apparently hid in the trunk of a tree, and when they got him, they cut it in half. Now, this story of his death spread among the Jews and the Arabs, and so you find that the Muslims certainly agree with the story. When we come to the New Testament, to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13, there's a reference to the greats of old. You know, Hebrews 11 is this chapter of the ancient worthies, and it refers to those to a prophet who was sawn in two. It doesn't name him, but it refers to a prophet who was sawn in two. So this evidence would suggest that poor old Isaiah didn't finish up in a very nice way. And yet he was a wonderful man of God and a tremendous servant whose influence reaches right down to our time. Now, a brief look at the book of Isaiah itself. This breakdown is fairly artificial, but it gives us a sort of a summary that we can work with. Some people go so far as to say each three of these sections of Isaiah were written by different people. I don't think that's correct, but they say that. And one of the reasons they say that is because they have a limited belief in the ability of the prophet to predict the future. And so when he talked about Cyrus, that must have been that second Isaiah or Deutero Isaiah who wrote that. And while I'm not going along with that, because I believe there are very powerful arguments to say that Isaiah definitely did write the whole thing, even though there's also evidence, I think, that there was some editing has gone on with the documents in the time since his death, as has happened, I think, with practically every book of the Bible. But the first bit, clearly written during Isaiah's lifetime, or referring to the period during his lifetime, even though the whole lot could have been written, or should have been, I think was written during his lifetime. Chapters 1 to 39 take us up to the time when Hezekiah, you might remember, Hezekiah was a good king, and he was told he was going to die. Isaiah the prophet gave him that message, and then there was a very earnest prayer session, and his life was extended, and really the extended portion of his life didn't do him a lot of credit. And that takes us to chapter 39. And then we have what is sometimes called the second Isaiah or Deutero Isaiah, and this focuses more on events that happened after the captivity in Babylon. And perhaps either during and after. And Trito Isaiah, that really is starting at chapter 56 through to the end of the book. In some ways it makes a convenient way of looking at it rather than something that reflects the authorship. And one of the reasons I say that is because Jesus was such a fan of the book of Isaiah. Now, he quoted Isaiah to explain things he did. For example, he explained his reason for using parables. He quoted in Matthew, Mark and Luke all quote Isaiah chapter 6 in explaining why Jesus spoke in parables. He rebuked the Pharisees and the scribes for their lip service to God. Yet Isaiah said a lot about that. You go through this fasting and feasting and all these sacrifices and stuff, and what I want, God says, is just a humble, contrite heart. I don't want all of this stuff. And Matthew and Mark both quote Isaiah in recording Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisees. And the cleansing of the temple. The saying that my house shall be a house of prayer. He's quoting Isaiah. And it's quoted again by Matthew, Mark and Luke. And he told the parable of the vineyard. And so when we have Jesus telling the parable of the vineyard, he's building on and quoting from something that Isaiah wrote in chapter 5. He also quoted Isaiah to support his teachings. He told the purpose of his earthly ministry. And Jesus, of course, when he launched his ministry, said he was come to heal the sick and open the eyes of the blind and so on. He's quoting Isaiah. He told of the works that he was doing, and Luke refers back to Isaiah chapter 35. He told of the beginning of sorrows. And this is a reference from Isaiah 34, and it's recorded in Luke. And I'm sorry, our time doesn't allow us to go through and look up all of these verses today, but it would be a wonderful study to do so. He told of cosmic changes at the end of time. You know, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light. Things that we read about in Matthew chapter 24. And it's quoted out of Isaiah 13. He told of his own death. And he refers, of course, to Isaiah 53. And he told that his ministry will draw all people to him. And even that statement, he's borrowing it from Isaiah. No wonder Isaiah is called the fifth gospel. And he told the people that salvation had come to them. Now let's focus in the time that we have left on the part of Isaiah that we refer to as the suffering servant passages or the servant poem. It's all poetry. Doesn't necessarily look like poetry when you're reading the King James Version, but any modern translation, it will be set out as poetry because that's what it was. It was a poem. Here they're called the songs, the servant songs. They're in the book of Isaiah. And here's some quotes from them. Isaiah 41 and verse 8. But you, Israel, are my servant. Isaiah 42 verses 1 to 4. He shall establish justice on the earth. 49 verses 1 to 6. I will give you as a light to the Gentiles. And where have you heard that expression before? A light to the Gentiles. Yes, straight out of Isaiah. And Isaiah chapter 50, I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. And chapter 52 of Isaiah says his visage was marred more than any man. These passages, people have debated who did they refer to. Did they refer to Isaiah himself? Was it somebody else during Isaiah's time? Surely Isaiah was talking about things that happened in his own time. Perhaps he was, and if that's true, I don't know who he was referring to. And some people say these passages are not prophecy at all. The suffering servant is perhaps the prophet Jeremiah. He was a contemporary, or a specific leper whom the Babylonians exiles had seen die. In other words, they say it's about a real person who existed at the time the book was written. But there's a problem. There's a problem with all of these explanations. And if you look at the whole passage about the suffering servant, it becomes clear that it cannot fully refer to any other individual than Jesus Christ himself. And there's a problem for the people who want to split up the writing of the Isaiah into different eras or times because they don't believe in prophecy. None of them could argue that this book that we have a copy of a couple of hundred years before the time of Christ, that is the Isaiah scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls, could not have been written after the time of Jesus. Impossible. And yet we have Jesus quoting from it, and Jesus saying these passages refer to me. In fact, the suffering servant passages of Isaiah were the favourite reference that Jesus had to the reason for his death. Now, we know as good Adventists that the sacrificial system had something to do with it as well. And that's in the New Testament, but not nearly so much as the references to the suffering servant. Here are some key passages. Isaiah 53, verses 3 to 5. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord hath laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Who else could that refer to? Don't you see echoes of the Gospels all through this book that was written nearly 700 years beforehand? The servant songs, they bring the doctrine of salvation in the Old Testament, and particularly in the prophets, to its greatest climax. And here very clearly we see the belief that we have today that the vicarious, that is on our behalf, suffering was willingly accepted, and that the servant will succeed. And salvation also we find here is for the Gentiles as well as for the Jews. At his Last Supper, Jesus said, and he quoted the words, "It is written." Luke chapter 22, verse 37. And he was numbered with the transgressors. We've just read those words, haven't we? And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. And here's what he was quoting. Isaiah 53, verse 12. Because he poured out his soul unto death and was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So how did Jesus' disciples explain his death? Exactly the same way. Mark, we find in Mark chapter 15, 28 says, the scripture was fulfilled which says he was numbered with the transgressors. That's in Mark's account of the Last Supper. And Luke calls Jesus the servant without any explanation, which of course implies that that was the common belief among the early believers. As chapter 3 of Acts, verses 13 and 26, he refers to the servant as the paidia. It's a Greek word for his son. Your holy servant. It can be either son or servant. Your holy servant Jesus, he says. So in the early New Testament, our Lord was commonly believed, you might say universally believed among the early believers, early Christians, as the suffering servant. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. Remember the story about Philip the deacon. Philip was told to go to Ethiopia, of all places. And he was heading his way, and he came across somebody who was riding along in a chariot, a noble person, a leader of the people. He was riding this chariot, and he was reading. And Philip noticed he was reading from the book of Isaiah. And Philip was told to go and overtake the chariot. So Philip runs along and catches up with the chariot and says to him, I heard you reading the prophet Isaiah. And he said, do you understand what you're reading? So here was this man, and not a Christian, not a Jew, this nobleman from Africa, from Ethiopia. In the place he was reading in the scripture, according to Luke at Acts chapter 8, he was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation, his justice was taken away, and who will declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. And the nobleman said, the Ethiopian, he said, well, who does the prophet say this is? Who is this person? Good question. And then Philip opened his mouth, Acts tells us, and beginning at this scripture, Isaiah 53, preached Jesus to him. Then if we come over to Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter writes, Christ also suffered for us, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes we are healed. For you were like sheep gone astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. How are we healed by his stripes? It's worth thinking about, isn't it? It reminds us that he took our place. He was there representing us. He was treated as we deserve, so we can be treated as he deserves. What a powerful message. And it comes right out of the book of Isaiah, and it influenced the New Testament and the whole of the four Gospels as well, but particularly the entire New Testament, in such a dramatic and powerful way. Does it give you confidence in the Bible? It does for me. I think if you haven't been studying the book of Isaiah this quarter, the quarter's not over yet, it's not too late, and it will reward every effort. And it does throw light on the Gospels, on the light of the work of Jesus. He is the gospel prophet, and it's no wonder that a lot of people consider Isaiah the fifth gospel. Do you know how we're healed by his stripes? Well, I think one answer to that, and a very powerful one, is that his suffering, when we see what he did for us, does that change God or you? It's got to change us, doesn't it? God doesn't need changing, right? His attitude to us doesn't need changing. What needs changing? Our attitude to him. And when we see what Jesus did for us, that strikes at our heart. That changes us. That's the heart of the gospel. So we've seen Isaiah. Well, we've had a very brief look at Isaiah, really. It's got 66 chapters in it, the same number of chapters as the whole Bible has in books. And it's right in the middle of the Bible. It's called the fifth gospel for reasons that we've discussed. He's also known as the prophet of peace. We've learned about Isaiah the man, we've learned about Isaiah the book, and most tellingly of all for me, we've explored the suffering servant passages. And speaking for myself, being convicted again that Jesus gave his life for me. And the reason he did it was to change my attitude to him, to bring me into alignment with him. Well, we can talk about legalistic explanations, but I think the one that really matters is the one that changes us and starts the process of us being recreated into the image of God. What do you think? Well, thank you very much for your attention today, and that's where we leave our message.